Hi, and welcome to our last learning objective, chapter 6. And of course, I had to do a retake on this whole thing just because, of course, I did. It was the last lecture. So let's go ahead and let me share my screen with you. Okay, so here we're going to talk about capital flight. And what's interesting about capital flight, we've been talking about these three graphs, right? Graph 1, the market for loanable funds domestically, right? Okay. Graph 2, net capital outflow. Graph 3, which I usually place down here, the real exchange rate, right? So we know that the loanable funds, we're going to see things that affect national savings, things that affect investment, net capital outflow, and then byproduct, real exchange rate. Again, notice the net capital outflow here and here, the joiner between the two graphs. Over here, we see some variables of net exports. We see net capital outflow and the byproduct being the real exchange rate. So far we've looked at things that occur in a country starting in graph 1 and the ripple effect from the other two graphs. We talked about starting in graph 3, right, in terms of import quotas and those kind of things, rippling to graph 2 and 1. So in this particular objective, what we're going to look at is capital flight, which begins in graph 2 and then kind of ripples out to the other two graphs. Okay, so what causes and what is capital flight? Capital flight is a reduction in the demand for assets, and let's call these financial assets located within a country. Okay, it could also be depending on, it could also be foreign direct investment, so it could also be physical assets. So when you look at financial assets or physical assets, particularly physical assets, you should start to think about the I in the national income accounts, the investment. Okay, so this Mexico experienced some political instability in 1994. This is one of the things that we look at. It affected the Mexican government and it also affected the US. We're going to look at the Mexican government first. So in terms of what happened, if we're in graph 2, okay, and that is the net capital outflow graph, we're going to begin with just net capital outflow, okay? And remember that the first graph, the market for loanable funds, comes in, and then we drop it down, and that becomes net capital outflow, and then we propel it into the third graph. Okay. So because it starts with net capital outflow, basically what's happening is people are wanting to sell Mexican assets. So there's going to be a huge amount of capital flying out. Okay, that's why we call it capital flight of Mexico. So in terms of what happens, the net capital outflow for Mexico will shift. This is again the second graph, outward and to the right. When it does that, that net capital outflow will do a few things. Net capital outflow will increase. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so if it's increasing, it's likewise increasing here, right? So we can see that the real exchange rate, if we go into graph, what's happening then in graph 3, net capital outflow moves outward and to the right. Net exports, right? Exports minus imports. Net exports are going to increase, and the real exchange rate, as you can see it here, decreases. Now, really, the real exchange rate decreasing is the first thing that happens, which is the reason why exports increase so much. Okay, so these are not necessarily in exact order. When net capital outflow increases in graph 1, we also have some changes. The demand for loanable funds investment plus net capital outflow. So we're focusing on this net capital outflow part. Increases. That then, so we have net capital outflow in graph 1 increasing. That will increase the real exchange rate. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit more in depth. Oops, sorry. Okay, so we have a reduce in domestic investment. Okay, the interest rate in Mexico increases. That's bad for Mexican citizens, right? So that slows capital accumulations. People don't want to borrow. Okay, so that slows economic growth. More so, the exchange rate decreases, exports become cheaper, imports become more expensive. And again, remember, this is all in Mexico. And so the balance of trade moves toward a surplus because we're now going to export more than we import, but imports are going to be much more expensive to us. At the same time, things are happening in the United States. I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. In the US market, because the interest rate in Mexico increased, and it stayed the same in the US, rate unchanged, then basically what we have is a fall in US net capital outflow. Again, starting with that second panel. So net capital outflow decreases. How does that affect graph 3, the exchange rate? Well, if we have net capital outflow here, and then it decreases, and we have net exports, then essentially what's happening is the real exchange rate on the dollar is increasing. Okay? In graph 1, what's happening? In graph 1, as you can see, that excuse me, demand curve, investment, plus net capital outflow. Net capital outflow is going downward. The demand curve is going inward. And if we have national supply, national savings, so you can see that the US interest rate would be falling. Okay, so that's this portion. Now, not a big impact because the US is so large. But what if this happened in, for example, China, where they have a rather large economy? So I could have paraphrased about 6 or 7 slides here, chose to show you a video instead. I hope that this course has been, you've learned a lot. Let me know, please, if there's anything we can be doing better. I say we in terms of me or college in that respect. And thank you for participating in the course during this difficult time. Thanks.
China has been experiencing an unprecedented bout of capital outflows. Estimates of the size of these outflows vary, but some of the latest reckon that about 610 billion US dollars flowed out of China in the year to the end of July. August then saw a rapid acceleration, with around 150 billion US dollars leaving in just 1 month. That's according to Jian Guangshen at Mizuho Securities in Hong Kong. The outflows are worrying to China because they mean that companies and individuals are losing faith in Beijing's ability to generate fast-paced growth and are consequently looking for higher returns elsewhere. Often, this is in the US and in Europe, where Chinese property buyers have become key players in the high-end real estate market. The other thing that the outflows suggest is that Chinese increasingly think that the renminbi is set to fall against the US dollar and are thus buying US dollars before this happens. The problem has prompted Beijing to tighten capital controls. It's ordered financial institutions to step up checks on people trying to smuggle money overseas, and in particular, to crack down on the practice of over-invoicing for exports. This is a long-standing ruse that Chinese companies use to spirit funds overseas.